What happened when you finally reach a breaking point, and how it ended?
My name's Ethan Carter. I'm 27, and for the past 4 years, I've worked at Hargrove Manufacturing. It's not glamorous. Punch in, grind through 10 hours of repetitive tasks, and punch out. The factory produces small mechanical parts for bigger companies, stuff most people never think about: valves, bolts, things that end up in cars and machines. We're a small operation, barely 50 of us on the floor, but the work never stops. It's loud, it's dirty, and most of the time, it feels like you're part of the machine, not the person running it. I never planned to be here. Growing up, this factory was just another building in town, something you passed on the way to school. My mom used to tell me and my sister Grace that we'd never end up in places like that if we worked hard enough. But life has a way of laughing at your plans. When mom got sick, I dropped out of community college to help her and Grace. Bills don't wait for dreams. Hargrove was hiring, and I was young, strong, and desperate enough not to care about the terms at first. I convinced myself it wasn't so bad. Sure, the pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and I needed steady. The hours were brutal 10, sometimes 12-hour shifts, but overtime pay made it bearable. I told myself I'd save up, send Grace to college, and maybe one day find my way out of there. Then things started changing. Hargrove's owner, Mr. Hargrove Sr., passed away about 2 years ago, and his son took over. Junior, as we called him, not to his face, of course, came in with big plans to streamline operations. At first, that meant cutting corners. Fewer safety inspections, cheaper materials, equipment that broke down more often than it ran. The kind of stuff that makes your job harder but doesn't feel like the end of the world. We grumbled, but we adapted. What choice did we have? Then the cuts started hitting us directly. Overtime pay disappeared overnight, replaced by a flat rate system. Junior called it modernizing the payroll. We called it theft. Suddenly, those long shifts didn't come with any extra compensation, but the workload didn't change. If anything, it increased. People started getting hurt. Minor stuff at first. Cuts, bruises, sprains. But then a guy in my line, Mike, got his hand crushed in one of the presses because the safety guard wasn't replaced after it broke. He didn't come back to work after that. I kept my head down, even when I knew it wasn't right. I told myself I couldn't afford to make waves. Grace was finishing her second year of college, and I wasn't going to be the reason she had to come home and give up her dreams. But the thing about exploitation is, it doesn't stop unless someone stops it. And the day I realized that was the day I stopped being silent. It started with the new quota system. Junior decided we weren't producing fast enough, so he upped the output numbers without increasing the time or manpower to meet them. Anyone who couldn't hit the target got written up, and 3 write-ups meant you were out the door. People started skipping breaks, skipping meals, just to meet expectations. That's when I hit my breaking point. I remember the exact moment. It was a Friday night, and the machines were roaring louder than usual. Junior had been pacing the floor all week, barking orders and scowling at the numbers on his clipboard. I'd already skipped my lunch break to stay on pace, and my hands were shaking from exhaustion as I loaded another batch of parts into the press. The air was thick with oil and heat, the kind that clings to your skin no matter how many showers you take. That's when it happened. A guy a few rows over, a kid, really, just out of high school, fainted at his station. He hit the floor hard, but the machines didn't stop, and neither did the rest of us. That's how it worked here. You didn't stop unless someone made you, and no one ever did. It wasn't until someone shouted that the supervisor finally noticed. He walked over, gave the kid a nudge with his boot, and radioed for someone to drag him to the break room. No one called an ambulance. No one even checked if he was okay. Junior didn't even look up from his clipboard. Something inside me snapped. I stood there, staring at the empty space where the kid had been, and I realized this wasn't just about me or Grace or even my paycheck. This place was breaking us, grinding us down like the metal parts we made, and no one was going to stop it unless we did. That night, I went home and started making a plan. I didn't know much about labor laws or unions, but I knew enough to start asking questions. I stayed late after shifts, talking to people one-on-one, listening to their stories. Most of them were just as scared as I was, but they were angry too. Angry at the write-ups, the injuries, the long hours with nothing to show for it. Little by little, we started to come together. We kept it quiet at first. Meetings in parking lots, whispered conversations during breaks. I started documenting everything. Unsafe conditions, unpaid hours, injuries that went unreported. I encouraged others to do the same. It wasn't easy. People were afraid of losing their jobs, and I couldn't blame them. But the more we talked, the more we realized we weren't as powerless as we'd been made to feel. The tipping point came when Junior announced mandatory weekend shifts with no additional pay. That was the final insult. By then, we had a small group willing to take a stand, and we decided to file a formal complaint with the labor board. I submitted the paperwork under my name, knowing full well it could cost me my job. The day the inspectors arrived at Hargrove Manufacturing was like a storm hitting the factory floor. For months, we'd worked in fear and silence, but now, the power shifted. It was no longer Junior's clipboard dictating our lives. It was theirs. The inspectors started in the loading dock, moving methodically through every inch of the factory. Their sharp eyes scanned everything. Broken safety guards, rusted emergency shut-off switches, overloaded storage shelves. Everywhere they looked, they found violations. The first major finding was the lack of functional safety equipment. The inspectors noted that several of the machines lacked proper guards, including the press where Mike lost his hand. They measured the noise levels in the factory and determined it exceeded legal decibel limits, meaning workers were at risk of permanent hearing loss. I saw one of them jotting down a note about how no one had been provided ear protection in over a year. Next, they turned their attention to the time cards. I had suspected the company was fudging the numbers, but even I wasn't prepared for the extent of the fraud. They discovered that overtime hours were logged but never paid, and several workers' breaks were being deducted from their hours, even though most of us never actually took them. For a company that claimed to be struggling financially, Junior had been suspiciously good at squeezing every cent out of us. They also found stacks of write-ups hidden in the supervisor's office, write-ups for fabricated infractions like moving too slowly or failure to meet unrealistic quotas. Those papers became evidence of a clear pattern of retaliation used to intimidate workers into silence and compliance. One of the most damning discoveries came when they reviewed the accident reports, or rather, the lack of them. Injuries that should have been documented and reported to workplace safety authorities had simply been erased. Mike's injury wasn't even in the system. It was as if he'd never worked there. I overheard one of the inspectors mutter the word criminal under his breath as he flipped through the empty accident log. By the end of the day, the factory was in chaos. Junior tried to deflect blame, saying he didn't know about most of the issues. But the inspectors weren't buying it. They issued immediate citations and ordered parts of the factory to shut down until repairs could be made. Workers stood in clusters, whispering to each other, finally daring to hope that this might lead to real change. The inspection report was brutal, and it didn't take long for the results to ripple through the company. Hardworking Manufacturing was slapped with hefty fines for safety violations, wage theft, and failing to report workplace injuries. But that was just the beginning. Several of us, myself included, filed a class action lawsuit against the company. With the evidence we'd gathered and the findings from the inspection, our case was rock solid. The court ruled in our favor, awarding damages for unpaid wages, injuries, and the hostile work environment. The payout wasn't just money, it was validation. The financial hit was too much for the company to handle. Between the fines, the lawsuit, and the cost of overhauling the factory to meet safety standards, Hardworking Manufacturing couldn't stay afloat. Within 6 months, they filed for bankruptcy. The factory shut down, and Junior disappeared. Rumor had it he fled town to avoid further legal trouble. It wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, but it felt like justice. For years, they had exploited us, treating us like we were disposable. Now, they were the ones being held accountable. As for me, life moved on. I found work at a smaller shop a few towns over, a place where people were treated like humans, not machines. Grace graduated with honors and started a career that would have made Mom proud. Every now and then, I think back to those days at Hargrove, the noise, the heat, the fear, and I remind myself that silence is what keeps people like Junior in power. We spoke up, and it mattered. It always matters.
Like and subscribe.